welcome everybody to the DANSOX Summer School. It's wonderful to see real people in the space live today. There's a couple of things I want to say, a couple of people to thank. First of all, most of all, I want to thank my co-convener, Joseph Kay, who is a sound artist based in London, and he has, with myself and others, dreamt up this particular summer school. I'd like also to thank our patrons, Sheila Forbes and Monica Mason, for supporting DANSOX through the lockdown and onwards. And many thanks to the St Hilda's College staff, and most of all, the Jacqueline Dupre Building, Music Building staff, who have made this possible today, so that we can move into the 21st century and live stream, which is really tremendous. I'd like to tell everybody who is live streaming that there is an opportunity to ask questions if you pop them into the chat, and Joseph has very kindly agreed to field those at the end. Unfortunately, we don't have time for many questions, so if they don't get answered there, we'll endeavour to answer them personally afterwards. The live stream YouTube videos of the lectures will continue to be up on the JDP YouTube channel after the events of the summer school. So, to Alastair Macaulay. It's my huge pleasure to welcome Alistair, who's a renowned dance and arts critic and historian who writes and lectures internationally. He's well known to DANSOX. He's been a great friend to DANSOX and come back many times to lecture on Merce Cunningham, Frederick Ashton, Fred Astaire and George Balanchine in all kinds of weathers. We remember Alistair turning up in a snowstorm, in floods, and today we've got rain. But he continues to support us, which is wonderful. I can tell you about Alistair's long career in criticism and in writing. He was chief theatre critic to the Financial Times in London and chief dance critic to the Times Literary Supplement. He's taught and examined dance history for several of the country's first BA and MA courses in dance studies, and he's published a short biography of the ballerina Margot Fonteyn and an extensive book of interviews with the choreographer Matthew Bourne, a former BA student of his, I believe. As theatre critic, he had special interest in the work of Harold Pinter and Tom Stoppard, and then he went to New York in 2007, where he was invited to become the New York Times chief dance critic. And this changed, I imagine, changed his life completely. But he's now back after many years working in New York, back based in London, and continues to work on his eclectic interests in dance and dance history, on ballet, American modern dance, Indian classical forms, and many, many others. He's, I don't think I have anything more to say, really. Alistair will say it all. He's going to talk to us. Thank you very much for opening the DANSOX Summer School with Writing into Dancing.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Wonderful to be here again. Everybody's been assembling with such pleasure, just seeing friends, communities, and community colleagues. Sue Jones asked me to address one of two topics, either dance notation or the way that poetry and literature have inspired or intersected with dance. And my initial instinct was to resist both. I'm not a dance notator, and I don't read dance notation. As for the connection of poetry or literature to dance, I'm always wary of this because I'm devoted to the work of Frederick Ashton, who at the end of the Second World War, looked at the dance scene and was disturbed by how literary it was becoming. And as a struggle to move against that, he made his greatest work so far, the Symphonic Variations. And I like to think of dance that way. Dance that takes itself as its own subject matter. But the truth is also, Ashton was a reader. He took inspiration from poetry, including some of it, let's say, as background material in Symphonic Variations and other works. I would say that the greatest work choreographed in the 21st century, I have said this in the New York Times, and some of you will have seen it in London 2 years ago, is 4 quartets choreographed by the remarkable Pam Tanowitz. It was seen at the Barbican in May 2019. It was new the year before in New York State. Still hasn't been seen in New York City. And I think this response to T.S. Eliot's great 4 poems, 4 quartets, makes for extraordinary choreography. There are connections between words and verbal imagery and dance imagery, but mainly the extraordinary quality that this theatre work has is the way that the two and the music exist together. And really the theatre, the dance theatre that emerges, suggests that the poetry arises out of the stage world that Pam Tanowitz has created. You have a larger climate that is music and dance, which don't necessarily work together either. They coexist, and then the words come and give us an extra focus, and we see connections with the dance, but we don't necessarily see the one as an interpretation of the other. It's a fabulous achievement, this. We're also going to hear a talk on Monday by Lucia, is it Lucia? About Agon. And it occurred to me that though Agon is a classic case of a dance that takes dance as its own subject, I believe it also has a poetic connection. It was conceived as one of the last of a trilogy by Balanchine and Stravinsky, and the other 2 parts of the trilogy are to do with Greek poets. Apollo, the god of the arts, but particularly poetry and music. Stravinsky once said that the subject of Apollo is versification. He's particularly referring to Calliope's variation, but also to the whole work. And there's a lot of poetic meter throughout the music. Orpheus is, of course, the poet and musician whose life becomes a major distraction and tragic against his poetic inspiration, and the tension between the two is the subject of that ballet. Agon goes beyond plot, but I believe that Balanchine and Stravinsky may have taken their title. Agon, of course, means contest or struggle, but I think at that time, in the 50s, people were starting to look back at the poetry of Pindar, the great early Greek poet, probably a little after Homer. And Pindar wrote poems for the great sporting competitions of Greece. Extraordinary poetry that almost reaches an abstraction of its own with, again, words about words, connection between literary form and its own verbal context. I'm in danger of getting off onto Pindar, so I mustn't, but I think that is part of what was in the background of Agon, among many other things. I'm at work, in particular, when I don't have too many distractions, on a critical biography of Merce Cunningham. Now, Cunningham would seem to many of us to be the major example of a choreographer who took dance as its own subject. That's absolutely what he said many times. But guess what? Cunningham also was a reader. 2 of his works, maybe more than 2, but I can think of 2 straight away, take their titles. He didn't draw this attention to anybody, but they take their titles from poems. So one of his famous, most radical theatre pieces, Winter Branch. Winter Branch, those 2 words come together in a poem by Wallace Stevens, and it occurs to me that that's where Cunningham took that title from. And 2 years ago, I went to see Tennessee Williams's, what was the great play? Anyway, the play with the world's oldest poet in it. And at one point, as he's about to die, this poet who's the grandfather of another character in the play, suddenly produces the first poem he's been able to produce for a long time. And in the middle of it comes the phrase native green. And Cunningham in his 60s made a dance called Native Green. I think he was inspired by that bit in Tennessee Williams' play. It's what's Night of the Iguana, that's the play. We're now in an extraordinary situation where we can go through Cunningham's notes. Going through Cunningham's notes, they're in the New York Public Library. As one of his former dancers said, it's like being allowed to look at his underwear. It's kind of embarrassing. Nobody was allowed to look at his notes except for very special staging purposes during his lifetime. And very few people looked at his notes even then. But now we can look at notes that for dancers that he dropped in his lifetime, and nobody ever saw his preparation. I was amazed to find a lot of notes for the work he made in 1953 called Septet. It's been danced here by the Rambert and other companies around the world. It's the last piece he made, or almost the last piece he made, in an intuitive manner in response to music, which is atypical for Cunningham. But at the top of his first lot of notes, he simply talks about a book by Pierre Louis, who's a sort of Wildian late 19th century French writer, both a poet and still something of a patron saint writer to lesbians, because he talked about same-sex affection, particularly between women, as well as heterosex. But his book, Aphrodite, set in ancient Alexandria, is extraordinary, and it is Aphrodite that Cunningham took his inspiration. It seems at the top of his notes for Septet. Now, I can tell you if you read Aphrodite, and I have twice, and you know Septet, you'll still go, what? There's no clear connection, but you do start to see certain possible meanings that take the skin off you, so to speak. It's so much more shocking than what he may have had in mind. In a way, I kind of don't want to reveal this in a book, because Septet is a beautiful dance in its own right. But there it is in his notes. One of his best-known dances, famous for its radical decor by Andy Warhol, is Rainforest, 1964, with those famous floating balloons that all of you will have seen in photographs, and sometimes in film, or indeed in performance. It's been done by, I think, the Rambert here, and the Cunningham Company brought it here more than once. For some reason, people haven't drawn attention to something that Cunningham did allow to be known in his lifetime. He only talked about this about a year after he made it. Cunningham was crazy about anthropology, and he read a well-known book by the anthropologist Colin Turnbull called The Forest People. And Colin Turnbull, in the late 50s, early 60s, had been to, I think, the Belgian Congo, and had spent time with pygmies. And Cunningham dreamed up Rainforest out of this. Again, the connection between the book and the dance is not clear, not obvious, but that's kind of where he got the idea from. When he, if you know Rainforest, the curtain goes up and you see Cunningham, or the dancer, doing his role quite near the front of the stage, but at his feet is a smaller woman dancer at his feet. And they're both doing paw-like gestures that may let us think that they are animals. But when the work was originally made, this smaller role was made for Barbara Dilly-Lloyd. When she was replaced, she left after about a year. He gave the role to Meg Harper. And once, as the curtain was about to go up, Cunningham just said quietly to her, "We're pygmies, by the way." And he normally never gave any interpretative clue. And Meg Harper thought, what? She actually said, I'd been dancing it quite a long time. I didn't allow that to change my interpretation. But I think Cunningham said it to her for a reason, because he wanted her to realize that aspect of the movement. Anyway, this is all preamble about the possible many connections between literature and dance. Obviously, we could all be here for a month-long conference about those connections. I am going to talk much more about notation, because though I don't notate and though I don't read notation, I realize that over the last 15 or so years, I've been pursuing conversations with people who are skilled this way. And because I've been looking at dance, particularly ballet, for many decades now, I have quite a good store of questions to ask them. Most of these people aren't just notators. Notation never exists by itself, it exists in context. Most of these people are historians for whom notation is part of their skills. I'm starting now to put conversations, let's say questionnaires, with these historical notators on my website. It really began, I'd particularly like to thank Alexei Ratmansky, because in 2015 he staged his first work from Stepanov notation of The Sleeping Beauty. He did it for American Ballet Theatre. And unusually, American Ballet Theatre's press office, who normally were a little shy of asking clever questions from the critic from the Times, but this time they rather pointedly said we would welcome questions about our production. So I thought, oh, well, I'll pursue this. And of course I had lots of historical questions as soon as I saw the premiere, and I fortunately was allowed to see something like 5 performances before I filed my review for the New York Times. So I think I sent them straight away 5 questions after the first performance. And back came these unusually intelligent, detailed answers. So I asked some more, and then I got more wonderful answers. And of course, I gradually realized this wasn't the press officer, it was Alexei Ratmansky himself, who was just in the right mood to answer questions about restoring The Sleeping Beauty as he understood it, and all the research he had done around the notation, as well as just working on the notation itself. And gradually this turned into a questionnaire that we worked on for 3 months. And I think eventually there were 101 questions from me and often very long answers from him. It was very gratifying, I think, for both of us. I realized also by then I'd been having, not in writing, but lots of conversations with Doug Fullington, who's the historian who's looked into Stepanov notation, I think since the 1990s. And he's about to, well, he's already been teaching the dances from the notation for Petipa's Raimonda, which is going to be staged by English National Ballet at the beginning of next year. The posters are now out January. That's based on Doug's reading of the Stepanov notation, and I will be working on a questionnaire with him. So this is really a larger project. Sitting in our audience here is Moira Goff, and I just wrote to her this week. Moira and I go back to 1992. We realized we'd met because we'd both been researching the 18th century ballerina Hester Santelot. But I'd been researching Hester Santelot because I was so fascinated by her life, her context, indeed her descendants. She's the ancestress of Princess Diana, blah, blah, blah. But I liked looking into her career. She's the first case of a ballerina who was the muse to a choreographer, John Weaver. The one thing I hadn't looked into was the one that Moira had been looking into, which was crucial, which is her dances, which exist in notation. And Moira came up to me once in 1992, introduced herself and said, I think you should be looking at this. Well, I've never gone into those notations, but I've watched Moira dance some of those dances and I've asked her about them. So we will be working on a questionnaire about foyer notation, which is going to be also part of the subject, I think, in this conference. Also, while I was in New York, I found I just wanted to convene gatherings of scholars. So one of the projects I'm most proud of working on was an annual seminar on an individual ballet. It really began with the wonderful scholar David Vaughan. I realized he had spent many years working with his fabulous memory on pieces on the Sleeping Beauty, to which he brought great scholarship. And I thought, David's not going to last forever. He has since died. I wonder if the New York Public Library will record conversations that I and Robert Greskovic could have with him. That's 3 critics who all know our Sleeping Beauty in some detail. And the New York Public Library said, yes, as long as you do a presentation at the end of it, which was a great exercise for all of us. The next year, we did it with Swan Lake. And then following years, I began to gather further scholars. We worked on Balanchine's Serenade, on Giselle, on both the Nijinsky L'après-midi d'un Faun and the Robbins Afternoon of a Faun, and on Balanchine's Apollo. And all of these have been filmed and they're in the New York Public Library. And I'm quite proud that we just simply got these together. Often I'm not the person talking, but we got people talking to each other or pooling so much information, often while watching films, historical films of importance. For example, Jacques d'Amboise died a very few months ago, the great leading dancer of New York City Ballet from the 50s through to the early 80s. He was the breakthrough Apollo for whom Balanchine staged Apollo with no real scenery except for a staircase. He had worked with Balanchine not just once on Apollo, but for over 10 years. And when you showed a film of him doing Apollo, he simply kept up very gently a running commentary. This is where Balanchine said this. And you realize Apollo is about poetry, and this is where that is the meaning of this gesture. Well, we've got Jack's voiceover there recorded at the New York Public Library. I'm very proud of that. So there are questions to ask for notators. I hope many people will have these conversations, but I'm happy to be one of them. When I was preparing for this, I thought, well, I'm going to bring Monica Mason because she's the patron, of course, of DANSOX, but I have many happy conversations with Monica, and I know that the Royal Ballet is perhaps the most exemplary case of a company that is based on notation. It has been using Benesch notation since about 1960. So I spoke to Monica earlier this week, and she absolutely preached that as the gospel, saying, I cannot imagine the work of the Royal Ballet without notation. We depend on it so much. But she very instantly gave me a very interesting example, which connects in a way to DANSOX, because if you came to its opening session in 2013 here, Monica showed a film of herself doing the dance of the Chosen Maiden. And she's very attached to this role. She teaches it to this day. But she interestingly told me one of the first other women to be taught the Chosen Maiden was Virgie German. And Virgie and I, Monica Mason, both began to study Benesch notation ourselves. She said it wasn't really for me and I gave up after a while, but she said Virgie really acquired skill at it. And once I'd been dancing Rite of Spring a lot in a big tour, and I came back and started to rehearse it again, and Virgie looked at the notation score and quickly, friendlily, because they were exact contemporaries, I think both from South Africa, just said, Monica, I don't know if you're aware of it, but you've changed one or two of the steps. And Monica was startled. She said it was nothing large, but she said Virgie was able to show me, and Monica said, I love it best of all. I like working with a notator, but I like it best if the person is a dancer, particularly an experienced stage dancer. Virgie was the ideal person to show me, and I quickly recognized the steps. She said, I don't know how I made the change, the kind of thing that happens. So that's one example of the use of notation. Another one also comes from the Macmillan Repertory. It's a conversation I had with Deborah Macmillan, the choreographer's widow, 19 years ago. She said that when she went to watch the Paris Opera Ballet dancing Manon, Monica Parker, the main Benesch notator who works on the Macmillan Repertory, the dance that Manon does in Act 2 with the 8 men, it suddenly began with a big, strong man lifting Manon slowly. Now, for years up to this point, we'd been watching it just done with Manon doing the first lift, suddenly going up into the air. And Deborah, like all of us at that point, was used to seeing the quick lift. And so she went to Monica Parker and said, that's a nice change, but where's it from? And Monica said, well, it's funny because that was choreographed originally on David Adams, who was the kind of hunk who can do a slow lift, but he didn't stay long after the premiere of Manon. The person whom Kenneth cast as the first man couldn't do the slow lift. It straight away became a quick lift up, and we all got used to that quick lift up. I'm looking carefully in the notation. Now, 20 years on, I realize what Kenneth originally intended. So that slow lift has been reinstated. I think the Royal Ballet now goes back to the slow lift. But if you're watching it, I think we're talking about the late 90s, up to that point, like Deborah Macmillan, you thought, where on earth has this slow lift come out of? The answer is the notation. Both Kenneth Macmillan and Frederick Ashton became absolutely used to working with a notator in the room. Becomes almost like part of your mind. And interestingly, I've been working on some sort of master classes with New York City Center, both this year and last year. And this year we got Matthew Ball to work on the first hour of creation of a solo for the Dante project with Wayne McGregor. And before we went on air, I quickly said to Wayne McGregor, would you be working with a notator? And he said, oh, absolutely. Everything I now make at the Royal Ballet, I have the notator in the room. And I wish I could remember her name, but he named her at once. As it was, this was just being done in social isolation type circumstances. Wayne in his studio in London and Matthew working at Covent Garden alone. And 10 days later, Matthew wrote to me saying, can you get us a copy of our program that we aired 10 days ago, because the actual license has expired, but we would like to see it because we actually now are going to choreograph it and we liked what we made that day. So there we are. I hope it's now notated for us all. By the way, I should also say, while we're looking into context, while we're looking into the work of these historians, some of whom use notation, I think this is a remarkable time to use social media. Aleksey Ratmansky, whom I mentioned, puts a phenomenal amount of historical research, his own work, on Facebook. Off topic, I also recommend following him on Instagram. He's the first case of a choreographer who's interested in the classical tradition, who's putting images of classical art on Instagram. There's something, if you follow Instagram, go to somebody with the name Greco-Ramansky, and that's his own nickname for himself, and all he posts is photographs of Greek and Roman works of art that he's looked in museums all around the world. I think it is the first time that we've been able to see a classical choreographer who's looking at classical works of art and just showing you what catches his eye. Quite often it's not what we would conventionally think of as classical, actually. I may be using the wrong adjective, but he is interested in the variety of Greek and Roman imagery. Now, these names I've been mentioning, Doug Fullington, Aleksey Ratmansky, really lead us to my next point, which is Britain was the center of notation for many ways, that Benesch and Laban both found homes here early on and were widely used. Of course, the Royal Ballet, originally the Vic Wells Ballet or Sadler's Wells Ballet, in the 1930s had a special relationship with Nicolas Sergeyev, who staged Coppelia, Giselle, Nutcracker or Casse-Noisette, Swan Lake or Le Lac des Cygnes, and The Sleeping Beauty, originally called The Sleeping Princess. Staged them for them, and they tended to guard them, we were told, like the crown jewels, the texts. The danger is, if you've been living with the Royal Ballet Repertory, and I certainly have been for many years, you tend to think that what the Royal Ballet has been doing is the original text staged from the notation. Actually, quite a lot of changes have been made all along. We'll be talking just about a few of these today. Changes get made. I'm not castigating the Royal Ballet for those, but what I think is worth pursuing is just checking what is original, why have some changes been made. Sometimes we do prefer the changes, and sometimes for good reason. Another change to the history of working with notation on these ballets happened in 1999, when the Kirov of all companies, today's Mariinsky, and originally the Mariinsky, went back sort of to the original, when Sergei Vikarev, a former soloist of the company, staged The Sleeping Beauty for his company, toured it internationally. It was seen in 1999 in America, the following year in London, and he had gone back to the evidence, not just for the notation, but of original costumes, original sets. Now, after a few years, the Mariinsky itself jettisoned his production, and Gergiev, who runs the Mariinsky these days, said, that's enough of these historical productions. Before then, they had already staged with Vikarev a Bayadere, about 1 or 2 years after The Sleeping Beauty. But the Kirov is no longer pursuing that avenue. Nonetheless, it made a great impression around the world. And other people started to realize we too could look into the notation, because guess what? They're not in St. Petersburg anymore. Sergeyev smuggled them all out of Russia in 1918, and they're now in the Harvard Theatre collection. Many of them can be viewed online, for free, by the way. So Vikarev really helped the snowball to develop. Doug Fullington in the 1990s taught himself Stepanov notation. Ratmansky, I've mentioned. And I'm also today going to be showing a little of the work of a Spanish-German dance scholar, a former dancer called Swan. But there are many others out there working this way. Before I move on to this 19th century repertory, I also just want to talk about L'après-midi d'un faun, which is a one-off case. There are very few cases of choreographers who became their own notators. Václav Nijinsky wasn't the first, but he was one of the very few. He made L'après-midi d'un faun, I'm sure many of you know perfectly well, in 1912. We know it was a radical work, not least for the nature of its sexual content, but I think we're going to look at it today. You can see it's radical in many other ways, not least in terms of choreographic musicality. As you no doubt know, the next year he made the Jeu and the Rite of Spring, he got married and he got thrown out of the Ballet Russe. 3 years later, however, the Ballet Russe needed him and he crossed the world to join the company now in America for its 1916 tour. And in America, he straight away saw Massine, the young lady Massine, doing his role in Afternoon of the Faun, and he was upset. And Nijinsky wrote to the American papers saying, the Afternoon of the Faun, L'après-midi d'un faun that they're doing is not the ballet I made. And he quickly started working with the company. He did work with Massine, but also at that point, he notated his own ballet. So he's in a particularly firm mood that I need to get every detail right. And if you look at Afternoon of the Faun, you can see in a way it's made from the kind of creative mind that is akin to notation. It was notorious when it was new that he needed more than 100 rehearsals to make this ballet that's only about 10 minutes long. Fokine was going crazy because he was making Daphnis and Chloe, which is more than 4 times as long with a far bigger cast, and he didn't get as many rehearsals as L'après-midi d'un faun. That makes us think that Nijinsky needed this many rehearsals because he was a gauche new choreographer who didn't know his stuff. No, he was just a phenomenally precise choreographer and he needed to work with a greater precision than anybody had been at that time. When he was re-rehearsing it in America, one of the cast was the English dancer Lydia Sokolova, originally Hilda Munnings. If you don't know her autobiography, Dancing for Diaghilev, it's one of the great dance autobiographies, and she tells the story that when the chief nymph is frightened of the faun, that she showed fear on her face, and Nijinsky said, "Why are you doing that?" And she said, "Because I'm feeling fear." And he said, "No, the movement expresses everything. You need do nothing with your face." So this is another reason why this is radical choreography. The movement, the form, expresses everything. And as we know from so many other modernist works, Les Noces, much of Balanchine from there on, faces say nothing. This was the breakthrough of one of the breakthroughs of Afternoon of the Faun. Now, nobody at the time knew about or could read Nijinsky's notation. He had learned, all the dancers of those days, the Russian dancers, had been taught Stepanov notation, but he'd gone on to develop his own version of Stepanov. So nobody, if they'd looked at it, could have used it. Meanwhile, L'après-midi d'un faun was taught to the Rambert around 1930, and most other productions of Afternoon of the Faun derive from the old Rambert production. And we're going to look at one of the last of these, 1979. Nureyev, around the age of 40, 41, danced it with the Joffrey Ballet. But then Anne Hutchinson Guest, Queen of Laban notators, always interested in many other historical works for which there was documentary notation exercise evidence, got hold of the Nijinsky notation. At first she was baffled by it, but then she realized that Nijinsky had also notated some Cecchetti exercises. And she thought, well, I have studied Cecchetti in my time, and that for her was the Rosetta Stone. Once she worked out what Nijinsky, how he was notating Cecchetti, she then realized I can work on L'après-midi d'un faun. And many productions have been staged by Anne Hutchinson Guest and her colleague Claudia Jeschke around the world since I think the early 90s when they first started to stage it. Other traditions of L'après-midi d'un faun continue, and we can, if we had time, we could go into what different versions of Fawn we like best. We're going to look at one of Anne Hutchinson Guest's, and we're going to look at Nureyev. Let's just look first of all at Anne Hutchinson Guest. This is a production from about 2017, done by New York Theatre Ballet. I don't think it's the best version of Anne Hutchinson Guest's realization of Nijinsky's notation, but it shows you the style very clearly. With the piano version, because New York Theatre Ballet is a small chamber company. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the dancer. Just analyze the connection of movement to music. It's so curious, there's so much of the music that Nijinsky isn't using, but then when he does, you really feel the connection. Also, he's very often working in terms not of cues or rhythms, but of phrases. Long phrases and gestures to the long phrases of the music. Designs, of course, are by Baxt. And though the costumes are Grecian in style, the whole look is really, in some ways, post-impressionist. It always reminds me of a VR painting. You see how Nijinsky gives each nymph some movement of her own. They're all distinct characters, even though they move often together. Of course, the Nijinsky choreography, or the Debussy music which it responded to, was in turn inspired by a poem by Stéphane Mallarmé, sometimes called the greatest work of French literature. Time, but of course what was extraordinary about it was the use of two-dimensional plastique, with the shoulders squared to the audience, the head almost always in profile. And there are just a very few moments when the dancers break out of that to address the audience, so to speak, or to address the planes that they're facing. the reasons she's not sure how to play it is because the nymphs come on and rescue her. She's not sure she wants to be rescued. All of that is quite clear in the way Nijinsky tells the story, particularly in the notation. It's all there. When we convened scholars and dancers on this, including two who had done the Anne Hutchinson version of the Nijinsky notation, the two men both said that one of the luxuries was that they had learned the movement and then worked on motivation privately themselves, and they'd come up with different conclusions. Michael Novak, who had played it at Bar, production seen by Sue Jones, had said that really he was always interested in the nymph, and he connects now to the veil because it's all he's got left of her. But Stephen Melendez, who was the other cast not seen here of New York Theatre Ballet, said, "Oh, I played it as if I was always wanting a veil in the first place. I wasn't so much interested in her, as if the fawn was a fetishist." It's nice to know that that ambiguity is there, and both of them said it was just a luxury to have the movement in them and then to begin to inhabit it. Look at the way, by the way, he is walking, which we're going to see something very different in a while. And look at the way he climbs the steps. This, when you get the gesture of fetishism, that you start to realize that this is a shocking ballet. What it was like in 1912. Sometimes it's called masturbation at the end of the ballet. I think it's a wrong description. But it is fetishism, I believe. And only now does he turn away from the two-dimensional plastique and addresses the sculpture with the whole of his body, which adds an extra shock element. Let's go straight from that into Nureev's production. I need hardly to tell you that Nureev did his own thing. And I would say that to knock it, but I found that at the 2017 seminar that we had at the New York Public Library, we had lots of Nijinsky scholars, Lynn Garafola, Joan Acacella, and others in the room. And interestingly, Joan Acacella, who did her PhD on Diaghilev and Nijinsky, absolutely advocated the Nureev interpretation of the faun. I disagree with her quite strongly, but let's look. We're just going to look at the last half of it. Sorry it's a bit blurry, but you can see it on YouTube if you want to double check it. As you see, being Rudolf Nureev, he does a whole lot of facial expressions. And look at the way he's walking. Flexing the foot first, which is not what we saw. course, it's wonderful hearing it with the orchestral version of the music. As he climbs the steps, you realize he does it with a releve each time, lifting the heel off the ground. That's absolutely not what Nijinsky wanted. It tells us so much about Nurev's own kind of theatrical instinct. He knew how to emphasize everything. Trust Rudy. So, amazing the difference. No other faun is quite so far away from the Nijinsky original as Nureyev. Just watching, of course, even in his early 40s, that kind of physique that he has, though, does add something to it. And to have something of Nijinsky's physicality in any great leading dancer does enrich the ballet. There are many others you can check out, not from the notation, but much nearer it, that you can see on YouTube, is a beautiful performance by Charles Jude with the Paris Opera Ballet. I'm not necessarily saying the Paris Opera Ballet is best, because I once saw Charles Jude do it at a matinee the evening after, I think, Kedar, Bellarbi. Bellarbi was one of the worst fauns I've ever seen, sort of the sexy John Travolta approach. But Charles Jude was absolutely beautiful and exemplary, and as he is in the video. If you see other versions of what I call the Anne Hutchinson Guest version of faun, Nijinsky's version, it is different with every interpreter. The Royal Ballet staged it, I think, in first 2000 and then revived it in 2004. It probably did it with about 4 or more different casts. Now let's really concentrate now on the 19th century repertory. It's really in the last 40 years that we've started, or people have started to go back to the Stepanov notation. The Royal Ballet staged the Nutcracker in 1984. It's the basis for the production it is still doing, but using some of the Stepanov notation. The truth is, they got some ideas of the notation and then did what they wanted to. So at one point, some critics were saying, we are seeing the original Ivanov snowflake choreography. We weren't, but we were seeing something that used a few ideas, often at the wrong musical moment. Nonetheless, people then started to realize we can use this notation, and in 1987, Anthony Dowell used some ideas from the Stepanov notation for his production of Swan Lake, which remained in Covent Garden repertory for the next 30 or 29 years. We now discover, or I'm beginning to discover from asking Alexei Ratmansky, that actually the Royal Ballet took some ideas and again sometimes did variations on them, often at the wrong moment. In particular, those of you who've seen that production will remember that it surprised us all that in the Adagio for Odette and Siegfried, that it brought in 8 junior swans, child swans, at various points, That's from the notation, but guess what? Not at the right moments. We're going to look at the right moment. As I think I've said, Sergei Vikarev shook up the whole scene in 1999. Doug Fullington began to work in the 1990s onwards, looking at. He also began to discover that there's as many other historians did too, that early in the 19th century, more notation with less movement analysis was done by the French ballet master Henri Justement. And Justement is fascinating because of the repertory that he knew up to the 1850s. He began to record such ballets as Giselle. And his scores are all around Europe, and people still have not collated them all. But both Doug Fullington and Alexei Ratmansky have now looked at the Justement version of Giselle, as well as the Stepanov notation of Giselle. Now, of course, by the time Stepanov notated it, or Sergeyev notated it, it was Sergeyev actually, at the end of the century and beginning of the 20th century, it had been completely reworked by Marius Petipa. And all kinds of changes have been made to Giselle. The notation of the Stepanov version, by the way, I hope you all know Giselle a bit, it ended with Albrecht dying. After he had lost Giselle, Albrecht then passed out, and originally the huntsman came on with Wilfrid and looking for their master Albrecht, only to find his corpse dead at the end of the ballet. This was the version, we can actually see it in photographs, that Robert Helpman did at the Sadler's Wells when he first did it with Fontaine, and probably when he first did it with Markova. Anyway, I've got so many things I could say. I'm having to stop myself from saying too much. Let's instead look at one of the most steppy dances, one of the things that notation is all about, from Coppelia. It's the dance for Swanhilda and her friends to theme and variations. The French title is 10 Slav variations on a Slav theme. And we're going to look at first in Vikarev's realization for the Bolshoi with the young Natalia Osipova as Swanhilda. Those of you who don't know Osipova should realize that she has the most phenomenal jump of any woman dancer in ballet of our time. Heavenly music. Very light but beautifully orchestrated. Such a variety of rhythm. And it too is a theme and variation. Here's the theme. Fifth position, going out in open first arabesque. And again, fifth arabesque. And in 1940, George Balanchine said to Enter and Denby, this dance, the theme and variations, is really the inspiration and the basis for all of my choreography. If you think about it, Balanchine loved the idea of theme and variations in his own choreography as well as in music. Now, if you know the Royal Ballet version of Coppelia, Susie here danced one of the friends here. You'll notice straight away we're looking at 8 friends. And that's correct. And originally the Sadler's Wells Ballet did do 8 friends. Annette de Valois made the change in 1954, giving it 6 friends. And it changes the whole feeling of this scene. Vikarev is using modern Bolshoi technique. The women get their legs up high. Almost certainly, Petipa's dancers, and this is almost certainly choreographed by Petipa, would not have extended their legs above 90 degrees. The first variation for Swanhilda herself. course, you see what a phenomenon Natalia Ostrova is. Look at her upper body here, because we're going to see Leanne Benjamin doing the Royal Ballet version, and you see that the upper body does something quite different. This is live at the Bolshoi, by the way. All of this is on YouTube if you want to check it out. This really is my favorite dance in the whole of Coppelia. You see how Petipa was celebrating what he saw as femininity. And I love basic steps here. I love the way the women are on point and just do releve retire as if it's the most yummy thing in the world. It's such a simple step, but it acquires such texture to the music. There we are. Releve retire. Actually, it's not releve, it's just retire. It's slow. Now look carefully at Swanhilda's second variation coming up here, because it's totally different to what the Royal Ballet has been doing, I think, since the 1930s. 16 grand battements raccourcis en grand enveloppé. Fits the music. I don't think she's dancing it with quite the right musical nuance. I think there should be more texture and phrasing as she brings the leg down each time. But it's a phenomenal step. Petipa did choreograph that way. He gave the same sequence in Sleeping Beauty to Aurora. Pamela May used to do it and always missed doing so many grand enveloppés. Okay, we don't have time to look at the fast conclusion. I wish we did. Can we go on now into the Royal Ballet version? This is 2003 performance at Covent Garden, Leanne Benjamin as Swanhilda. You see only 6 friends, and my eye now cries out for 8. The designs are by Osbert Lancaster. Sorry, the music's quiet. Are we able to get any more volume? Bum bum ba dum ba dum ba ba da dum liam ba dum bum ba 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 bum ba bum. Thank you. There's that step again. 5th position. Different musical emphasis. Some of us may remember that at one point Peter Wright did a new production in which he put men into this dance. I can't tell you how wrong that is for this music and this choreography. This is one of the real Petipa femininity numbers. So the music and the picture have come adrift. This is what happens on YouTube sometimes, especially in this kind of context. Don't blame them for being off the music. It's just one of the tricks that YouTube sometimes plays. And if you ever use YouTube for research, and we all do, just be aware, particularly when it's shown in a large context like this, that the music can come adrift. Love this music. Cascading strings. That pause that they do should be fitted to the pause we just heard in the music. So we've come about 3 seconds ago. Okay. explosive first variation for her. Similar steps to what we saw Osipova doing, not fully the same. Interesting that her footwork gets more texture out of the relevés than Osipova does. Now look at this. The upper body goes right over, and that is part of the Royal Ballet tradition. I believe it's absolutely right for music. It's the kind of thing that notation, Stepanov notation doesn't show clearly. Stepanov notation is very good for steps beneath the waist, not great for all the movements above. Three friends here where we did have four with the Bolshoi. My favorite step with the Retiries. I'm sorry the music has come adrift in this, because if you watch it on YouTube, you will see that the way these dancers phrase the music is really exquisite. Susie could probably show us the steps herself. She danced this many times. Right, here's her second solo. So instead of the grand battement raccourci or enveloppé, we have all this stuff totally on point, and then circling on point. It's wonderful, but it seemed not to be in the notation, unless the notation records two versions, which it occasionally does for ballerina solos. I'd love to know. I bet this is what Ninette de Valois herself danced. She had very strong feet, and she was a famous Swanilda in the 1930s. Okay, thank you. We'll end it there. So that just opens up this fabulous can of worms of the different readings of notation and different versions of tradition. Some of the questions to start asking. Let's get straight into La Bayadère. Now, as you know, this full-length ballet was choreographed in 1877 to music by Minkus. It was more or less unknown in the West until 1961, when the Shade Scene was brought by the Kirov on its first tour of the West. And it was the great revelation into Petipa choreography. People had known plenty about Petipa, had admired him, but now to see him working with a large corps de ballet on this scale and this kind of architecture really expanded anybody's understanding of Petipa. We're just going to look, though not at the corps de ballet, we're just going to look at the three soloists who do three very Petipa variations. And we'll look first at the Kirov in 1964, 3 years after they first brought it to the West. And then we're going to look at a version very recently staged in Spain by Juan Boccamp. He's put his version on YouTube, and he allowed me to ask him questions about it on Thursday night. Let's just look. The notation was made around 1900, maybe 1902. And the first variation is what we often see as the second variation if you know the Nureyev version. Let's go here. But this is the one that should come first. I suspect, and Juan Boccamp agrees with me, that this choreography was done probably around the time of the notation, because its use of point work is very much affected by Italian technique. Now, this ending is not part of the notation, as we will see. What we always see in Bayadère the whole diagonal of relevés, but it's not authentic. Now we go into the Cabrio Variation, as it's often known. Monica Mason was the first Cabrio Variation in the Nurea production of the Royal Ballet. Cabrio, 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 wait. And again. This and the previous variation are quite close to the notation. We're just looking at individual steps to get change. One of the problems I always have with these ballets that have been rediscovered in the West since 1961 is Minkus music. I always find it very and often very coarse. This is meant to be a scene in Elysium, the ghosts of Bayadères rising and descending the shades of the slopes of the Himalayas. In fact, we're just hearing this quite coarse music. But scholars tell me actually Minkus music has been coarsely orchestrated over the years, and when John Lanchbury reorchestrated it for Makarava's production, he made matters worse. And what they're all trying to do is to get back to Minkus's original orchestration, which they find much more sensitive, but it's very hard to get it out of the Russian archives. Ratmansky found a way of trying to thin it out when he staged his own Bayadère for the Berlin State Ballet in 2018. Okay, we're looking at Juan Botkamp. He has to use basically the more conventionally known music, or arrangement of the music. He's using pre-professional dancers, so you're not going to see great Kirov or Royal Ballet stars at all. But you will see different steps and different emphasis here and there. These are Spanish pre-professional dancers. This is on YouTube, by the way, so you can check it out. And he emphasizes that the hands cross at the wrists here. That, I believe, is in the notation. And of course, it's a reference to Marie Taglioni, whom Petipa must have had in mind because she had a vehicle called Le Dieu et la Bayadère. So it's Petipa referring to Taglioni. But that wrist crossing isn't always there in the various versions we see today. Now she begins it with relevés, and then she stops. Now this is the text that was notated around 1900 for Anna Pavlova herself. Actually, I'm wrong. It's notated for Trofilova, Vera Trofilova, who became a great Aurora in the West and a great Odetta Deal. We'll come to Pavlova in a moment. This variation is notated and possibly choreographed for a dancer whose name I do not know. I think Ryakova. I don't quite know more about her. I will be asking Juan Botkamp more. So the step before the cabriole is different from the one we saw in the Kirov version. And the timing of the pause at the end of that diagonal is different too. And Juan Botkamp showed me that the fermata in the music and in the notation score is shown as the pause really after the beat. Slightly different steps here. When we were going over in conversation on Thursday night, he said really the notation asks for those attitudes only to reach 45 degrees. It shouldn't go as high as today's dancers can't help doing. He wasn't blaming his own dancers, he was just saying it takes time to get nuance from any dancer, and he was working in relatively quick circumstances. And this is the one where the choreography has become most changed, but you can see the connection. And the score tells us Anna Pavlova was dancing this when the notation was done. One can't help wondering if Petipa had re-choreographed it for her in 1900. He loved Pavlova. Thank you very much. And something he also talked about, as does Doug Fullington and Alexei Romansky, is the terrific closeness you need between the conductor and the orchestra and the dancer, where all kinds of musical nuance would be ideal. These are to recorded music, so it's a problem. So much more to work on, but that itself becomes interesting. It raises the issues in our minds as to what is involved. Now we're going to look at the scene in ballet everybody thinks they know off by heart, which is Swan Lake, the Adagio for Odette and Siegfried. You all know the music, but you don't know the choreography. The critic Dale Harris always used to preach the motto about dance history: we know nothing. Please remember it, all of you, and recite it to yourselves regularly. Swan Lake is not quite the ballet we thought. We're going to look at two films of it. One, quite famous, Margot Fontaine dancing it with Michael Soames in 1959. Interesting because it uses Benno, who no longer appears in almost any version of the ballet today, and because, briefly, you can see that the corps de ballet are being partnered by huntsmen, which normally never happens in Swan Lakes today. It's there in the notation. This is not, it's often called a pas de deux, but it's really an unusual form, a pas de deux à trois, to use the phrase that they used to use at this time. A pas de deux in which there were two men doing the partnering. People have often thought that Ivanov, who was working with Petipa here, used an extra cavalier here because Siegfried was being played by the veteran dancer Pavel Gert, who I think was in his 50s when this was choreographed. Actually, if you look at the choreography carefully, Pavel Gert at that age was doing all the hard work. All the lifts were given to Siegfried. Benno is really just there to hold, catch Odette at particular moments, often very expressively, but it makes it a very different kind of world from what we often see as a pas de deux. Having huntsmen partnering the corps de ballet also changes it. When we look at the second film, which is of Alexei Ratmansky's 2016 production for the Zurich Ballet, we're also going to see what the notation shows of the 8 child swans whom I mentioned. Something I also want to draw to your attention is that the scenario does not ever ask, this is often talked about as a love duet. There is no definite implication in the story that Odette returns Siegfried's love. And I believe in both productions, not particularly in Margot Fonteyn, that she's not at all yet sure about the emotion she feels for Siegfried. She hopes she's going to fall in love with him. She hopes he's Prince Right. But heaven knows she is under a spell, under an enchantment. She is very wary of committing herself. And this effect connects to the use of the eyes. And Alicia Markova, who learnt 2 versions of Odette's Adagio, first just the pas de deux version, but she learnt it as a child from Mathilde Krzeszynskaya, and then she learnt it from Sergeyev in 1934 at Sadler's Wells, and she absolutely coached it, saying, don't look at the beginning of the Adagio. Okay, let's look. We're really just looking at the first 2 minutes of the Royal Ballet version, 1959. Look carefully and you'll see the young Antoinette Sibley in the corps de ballet. I love this music, just the harmony that Tchaikovsky achieves here, and building up amazing suspense. You see mime, Princess saying, the Queen, do you know where she is? Benno replies, no. And they both look. Clearly a platonic here. Here are the many, we are looking for the one. Where is she? That's, and then there on that front column there is led by Antoinette Sibley, aged about 20. In she comes, not really looking at Benno, and at this stage not really looking at Siegfried, at least not full in the eye. She's curious about him, but only when he's not looking at her. Look how quickly she folds to the floor, and we're going to talk about the floor later on. Very beautiful performance, this. Look at the huntsman there. Often now see ballerinas plunge into that penché arabesque, throwing both arms forward in a hugely emotional style. Fonteyn absolutely understood it as very classical, very severe, austere, formal. But that's the wrong emphasis on my part. The point really is that she's gathering courage here. She's not yet committing to herself. And she is an image, as you see, of purity. That's really why Siegfried falls in love with her, and he does fall in love with her, no question. Wonderful performance. I wish I could show all of it. We'll stop here, and now let's go into the next one. You're going to see similar choreography on the whole with the Ratmansky one, but different details here and there, and we're going to watch all of it. For one thing, you can see 8 junior swans at the back who danced in the waltz for the corps. Let's go. British dancer as Prince Siegfried, he's called Alexander Jones. I can't remember the name of the Benno. I believe he's Asian. I hope I've got that right. And I think a Russian dancer called Kapitanova dancing Odette when she comes in. I suspect this bit isn't really notated, and that Ratmansky was working from the Royal Ballet films, which he has studied. He's looked at all the evidence he can. I love the way that the 8 cygnets stand when their queen enters. Now she's looking at him in a different way, but she's also indicating shyness, reserve. Now there, look, the 8 form a semicircle behind her. We don't see this in any other version. And it suggests to us straight away the drama, which is that their fate are bound up with hers. She's using a slightly more romantic style than Fontaine. I don't say that's right, but I find it very interesting. And we do still feel that this is about her purity. And by the way, that crown and that plait are absolutely based on the 1895 production. So this is very much how the original Ivanov Petipa Odette was dressed. People often, of course, talk about her as a swan. When we see her, she is a woman. Interesting different nuance here. When she does those développés forward, she brings the leg down before she falls backwards, unlike Fontaine. I'd love to cross-question Ratmansky about that there. The leg comes straight down and then she falls. Now the choir all hop, but they don't hop across in front of the couple as we see in most productions. I'm not sure how clear the notation is here, but again, Ratmansky researched what he could very clearly, very thoroughly. I love those lifts. I would love to check the notation though, because Fontaine always began those lifts with 3 lifts, not 2, and made a particular musical effect by doing that. I like the musical emphasis here though too. Usually we see all different kinds of lifts, and most odettes get off the music totally. And as you see, the drama is all about her beginning to commit to him and then moving away. It's about the beginning of trust, this choreography. I love this lift. Normally we see her showing her knickers as she stretches her leg in the air. That's absolutely not stylish. I love what we see here. And the lift becomes really an expression of hope. Long look into his eyes. The arabesque she does on his arms is one of the steps Balanchine takes in Apollo, the duet with Terpsichore. The way the corps de ballet respond to her, this is true in most versions of Swan Lake, is part of the drama. All of them feel that their fate is bound up with hers. That's why this scene is like nothing else in ballet. And this moment is often the whole climax of the pas de deux. She breaks away from him and he decides not to go and partner her. It's she who makes the decision to return to him. I think if you follow this as a psychodrama, and I do, that's a very crucial moment. And the arms suggest a swan image, and he brings down the arms as if to say, you don't need to do swan stuff with me. Rocks are in his arms. For many people, this is the most beautiful moment in all of ballet. We're going to see it twice. Ratmansky broke my heart by saying though he put the rocking and the arms in this version, it's actually not in the notation, and he's not sure if this was there in the 1895 version. Now that folding over her own leg is so touching, and guess what? It may not be authentic either. This is where it's very interesting to follow Ratmansky on Facebook, and we'll come to that. Now we come to the concluding image. Petit battement serré, the finger poetic turn. If you look in the darkness at the background, the huntsmen have come in behind the core, and here comes Benno in case you've forgotten him. An image of chivalry, even though she never sees him, and she falls in a swoon into his arms. Great, thank you very much. It's still for all of us to work out what the emotion is, what the drama is in the scene, but it isn't the more romantic emotions, straightforward of mutual love that we often see in Swan Lake. I think it's something psychologically much more complex and much more interesting. I'm running over time, so we're quickly going to wrap up with photographs. 7 photographs really of further aspects of Swan Lake. Here's one first of Margot Fontaine. I posted this on social media 2 years ago. And when I did, yes, it was one of the most popular things I'd ever posted, and all kinds of people saying this is the most expressive, beautiful image. She's so bound up in swan form. She's so beautiful. She's so this. And after many people admired it, Ratmansky wrote in on Facebook saying, it's wonderful, but there's no evidence that Odette ever did this kind of bending over her own leg. I'm not sure. When I look at it, I think this kind of thing was brought in by ballerinas who'd worked with Fokin and Gorski, and it's probably not Ivanov's style. So it's one of these cases where we love choreography that is, or a version of choreography that actually is being done in an anachronistic style. Next one, please. This, another question. Ratmansky also says, I don't think she ever bent over her own leg, Odette, originally, the way we are used to seeing. Next one, please. He said, I put it into my own version, as you see with Capitan over here. But, next one, please. Here's Cassavana doing it, and there's all the evidence for before the First World War is that the early Odettes never really bent much further than that at the beginning of the Adagio. Next, please. Here are 2 more. One of these is Elseville. I can't remember the other one, sorry. But they're pre-First World War Odettes. Next, another one. That's as bendy as we get. Next, this is 1934, and it's Alicia Markova, as she'd been recently taught the complete ballet by Sergeyev, and she too is not bending in the modern way. What's also interesting, of course, is you see the huntsman as in the Ratmansky version. I love the suggestion that if everything goes happily, each man is going to have 2 brides. But I think that's just an accident. Okay, next, please. Now, that's the end of Swan Lake. This is another interesting question, because Sergeyev staged Sleeping Beauty, and this is Sleeping Beauty Act 1, at Sadler's Wells in 1939. He taught it to Margot Fontaine, whom we see here in Piqué Penché Arabesque. I never got to ask Fontaine about this, but Pamela May, who learnt it at the same time, always loved to say that Aurora should do piqué penché at the beginning of the violin variation, this step, and you can also find photographs of Pamela doing it. I've asked Ratmansky about this, and he says there's no evidence in the notation for penché. So why did Sergeyev teach penché if it's not in the notation? We can only speculate. It may well be that he was used to seeing a penché that the Mariinsky dancers of the teens of the century had begun to stretch the arabesque down and lift the leg higher, as we often see dancers do. Dancers love to, if they can get their legs up high, they do. That may be what he remembered liking in St. Petersburg and wanted to teach to Margot Fonteyn. Actually, it didn't, Poncher didn't particularly suit Fonteyn. I think she talked to other people like Kosavina, Preobrazhenskaya, Vera Volkova, taking advice. We don't quite know what changed her mind, but fairly early on, before 1946, she arrived in the more forward first arabesque that we usually see at this point. Okay, next please. This is our final image, and this is the end of what's often wrongly called the Black Swan Adagio. I think actually she's probably wearing scarlet here, but it's a black and white image. It's Moira Shearer, but this is how Petipa choreographed the ending of the Adagio for Odile and Siegfried. Normally we see almost the opposite, with him standing and presenting her upright, looking ahead the same way, but now she's looking into his eyes, and the way she's gripping his knees in penché, and he is as if in fealty, kneeling to her, actually takes us back to the image of chivalry that we have throughout the lakeside scene. So it's as if Odile here is saying, I am the Swan Queen you loved by the lake. This is in the notation. Ratmansky has restored it in his version. I wish somebody would start to restore it here. Fontaine got rid of it during the Second World War, or maybe early in the Covent Garden years, I'm not sure. But it was a good joke to Frederick Ashton, because if you watch Frederick Ashton's Cinderella, he and Robert Helpman, as the famous two stepsisters, and the roles are still danced, of course, by other men to this day, do all kinds of grand ballet steps that they aren't remotely equipped to do. And if you look at the Ashton stepsister, he grips his suitor's knee at one point, throws his leg up, and he's absolutely quoting this image. It was a ballet joke. Not for Odile, though. Really all I'm saying from all of this is there is much more work to be done. We have questions to ask. I'm not the only one, but I am now partly committing myself to asking these scholars who can do the notation, why have you reached this conclusion? What do you think is right? And it's fascinating that Ratmansky, Doug Fullington, Hwyden, Botkamp, Moira Goff, and Hutchinson Guest are all happy to answer questions. I'm not the only one, though. Please, others, help me to pursue this area of research. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We've run way over time. Do we have time for questions?
And then we'll have lunch at 1:45 and begin Joseph's workshop at 2:15. Okay, 2:15. So if burning questions, please ask them now.
That's enough to frighten anybody, isn't it?
It is. I have one, I just got a comment to make,
Okay.
that it's really started us off in this idea of just how ephemeral this art form is. That we're dealing with ephemerality, we're dealing with different forms of physicality. Notation is wonderful in it gives us a kind of an accuracy for something, for a moment. But we always need other layers of interpretation to bring to the score. But I mean, I think we would be lost without the score. So that is the only comment I'd like to make. Anyone else? Did anything come up on?
Yes, we did get a question.
Yes.
Joseph, give us the question.
The question was from Daniel Carey. Daniel Carey asks, by analogy with performing musical compositions with original instruments, would it be worth attempting reconstructions that follow not just the original steps, but also body shapes and movement style?
It's a wonderful question. It's related, I think, to what we've started to see with that more bending use of Odette in Swan Lake. Dancers, as they have got their legs higher and a more greater plasticity of the torso, we can see why Odette naturally now wants to fold right over her own foot at the beginning of the Adagio. to change that physicality is hard work. What's interesting, and I've only given you a few examples, but Ratmansky, particularly in his 2015 for Sleeping Beauty, got American Ballet Theatre, quite a showy company with lots of strong technique, actually to use the lower use of the leg, to use much more on half point when the notation asked for that, to use different kinds of piqué turns and chaîné turns, very often spotting on the front rather than in the direction of the turn, like Balanchine technique. But he said the notation doesn't necessarily show that, but that is the style that he understood from old Russian teachers. It's pre-Balanchine. So there are all kinds of aspects of period technique to be researched, and he's done some of this work. It's very hard to get today's dancers to continue to commit to it. That's the really hard thing. But there is so much to be discovered. Thank you.
I think that really sums it up.
What I can do with Ratmansky, when you see it done, often using half point and lower retires, for example, and lower extensions, you actually hear much more musical connection. There's all kinds of detail that comes alive in Sleeping Beauty choreography. Fascinating.
I think we should have a cup of coffee and ask Alistair questions outside. If anybody who's watching on live stream wants to answer questions, can we continue to put them into the chat and we will deal with them somehow or other. Apologies for the revised timetable, but it was well worth waiting and seeing these wonderful clips and having this insight into this form of shift between periods. Thank you so much,
Pleasure.
Alistair. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel as if I've spoken for 2 hours. How long did I speak for?